Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please come on in and find a seat from the hallway. We will be beginning in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please come in and find a seat. We'll be beginning our program in 3 minutes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our program is beginning now.
Is there a particular order you want
Let
this
me
in?
check with the moderator. I don't believe.
She might have an idea where she
Yeah, perhaps. I'm gonna get my coffee, but I. Yeah, good idea. Okay.
We are hesitating because we don't know whether you want us in. Oh, you're gonna. Can I put this here?
Please.
Don't take it away or
No,
I'll be
I
lost.
I'll keep it safe. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the 20th International Anti-Corruption Conference. We're almost halfway through the 5 days of plenaries, workshops, films, and all under the theme of uprooting corruption, defending democratic values. My name is Yolande Aguimont, your MC. Welcome to Plenary 4, Overcoming Corruption in a Race Against the Climate Crisis. Certainly a timely discussion, hot off the heels of COP27 that happened in Egypt just over a month ago. Before we get started, I ask you to please cast your eyes on the screens above. We're about to watch a trailer of Delicado, one of the documentaries being screened at the Films for Transparency Festival.
have friends who died doing this. Sometimes when I heard the critics say we should not do it because people get killed, I know that that is a good argument. I know. There is a spirit that tells me we have to do it because nobody else will.
President Rodrigo Duterte releases the controversial list of politicians allegedly involved in illegal drugs.
Nieves Cabonyalda Rosento, Mayor of El Nido. I will kill you? Yes.
Nakakalungkot po. Sino pa po ang lalaban sa El Nido kung lahat po tayo'y matatakot? Kaya nga po, kahit buhay po namin itinubuhis po namin sa bahay ito.
We have to stop the destruction. One forest at a time. One coral reef at a time.
Ayan, yan, oh, positibo!
Ito po yung kakunjak malis na palpito.
We have to stop these politicians. The last frontier is becoming the lost frontier.
That was Delicado, featuring land defenders from the Philippines. It's one of the documentaries being featured at the Films for Transparency Festival. That specific documentary will air tomorrow night at 6 p.m. in the Palladium Room. So straight to today's plenary, I'd now like to welcome our moderator, Caroline Henshaw, Environment Editor of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Caroline. I'm the environment editor for OCCRP. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a global network of investigative journalists who work together to focus on exposing organized crime and corruption around the world. So unless you've been living under a stone or you only watch Fox News, you will be aware that we are hurtling towards a climate emergency. In the past 50 years, we have lost 70% of global biodiversity. Since 1990, we have held literally dozens of international events trying to hammer out a way to solve the climate crisis. We have spent thousands of hours and millions of dollars on this. And yet, since 1990, we have produced more emissions than in all of history before that year. I think it's fair to say that humanity is facing an existential crisis, and we are failing to address it. Now, there are myriad reasons why this is happening, but one that does not get talked about enough is corruption. How corruption can undermine our best efforts to address this crisis and change the world for a better in the future. So today we have 6 panelists coming from very different backgrounds with very different knowledge, and we're all going to come together to talk about how corruption is undermining our ability to combat the climate crisis. I think we have a huge opportunity ahead of us, and this will be an incredible opportunity for all of us to discuss the ways that this corruption manifests and the ways that we can address it. So I will introduce everyone as they come up, one by one, but to kick us off, we have Patrick Alley. He is the co-founder of Global Witness, an organization that I'm sure many people in this room know because they operate at that crucial nexus between human rights abuses, corruption, and environmental degradation. And for those of you who don't know Global Witness, Patrick has written a book about it, so you can read that. Patrick, come up.
Thank you. I can thoroughly recommend that film. It's a hard watch, but it's a good one. The Beatles stayed in this hotel on their first US tour in 1964, and I thought it would be appropriate to quote a couple of lines from a George Harrison song. Beware of greedy leaders. They take you where you should not go. We're being taken to lots of places we shouldn't go. The colonial era scramble for natural resources is being dwarfed by the race that we're seeing right now to get hold of land, land for agribusiness, land for logging, land for hydro projects, oil and mining, etc. And as a result, the great savannas and the great forests, both in the north and the south, are being lost. And the lubricant that runs this destruction machine is corruption. There's a real possibility that the Amazon will reach a tipping point in just a few years, we're talking about like 4 or 5 years, after which our ability to tackle climate change is probably impossible. And there's obviously a real immediate human cost, as that film showed, as indigenous and local communities they're the best defenders of this land, and they're being pushed aside, and worse. 10 years ago, a Cambodian forest activist called Shuat Vuti was gunned down for his work. He was a former colleague of ours, the first person I've known personally to be murdered for the work he did. And that prompted us at Global Witness to think, well, how many of these killings do take place? And we started producing an annual report of these killings. We've done that every year since his death. And this year, we've produced another report, which I left down there, unfortunately, because I was going to show it to you, but called A Decade of Defiance, to sort of give a roundup of what's happened since his death 10 years ago. Since then, 1,733 land and environmental defenders have been killed. That's a minimum figure. It's obviously an underreported figure. Countless more have been attacked, criminalized, and evicted from their land. That's one mother and father, brother and sister, son or daughter killed every other day, just under 4 people a week. And these aren't just numbers, these are people. We know the names of every number we've documented. These people are the front line in our defense and the battle against climate change. And the fossil fuel industry is also taking us to lots of places we shouldn't go because they're hand in glove with our greedy leaders almost like nobody else is. Speaking at a conference in Houston on the 7th of March, a few days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the CEO of the oil giant Total, Patrick Pouyanné, if I got his name right, which I probably haven't, said, "My traders don't take any more oil from Russia since the beginning of the crisis." Good man, we thought, good man. 2 hours later, though, an oil tanker chartered by Total docked at the Primorsk oil refinery in western Russia and was joined later that day by a Russian-owned ship. Between them, they loaded 1.4 million barrels of Urals crude, worth $150 million, and set off for Rotterdam, where they unloaded on the 13th and 14th of March. By coincidence, that very same day, Greenpeace France and Les Amis de la Terre warned Total to be vigilant in case any of their operations were involved in the commissioning of human rights abuses. But Pouyanné responded robustly and said that the activities of his Russian joint venture partners, and I quote, are completely unrelated to the conduct of military operations by Russia in Ukraine. Really? Well, our data team took a look. Ternetsgas, a joint venture between Total and Novatec, which is a company Total had a share in, produces more than 60,000 tons of gas condensate each month, which is produced in their Purovsky plant. The Refinitiv database showed regular shipments of stabilized condensate going from this place to Omsk and to a refinery, representing about 8% of its stock. Then we started data crunching a rather large and obscure Russian rail freight database and discovered that deliveries of jet fuel from this place, 40,000 tons of jet fuel, were going to Su-34 fighter bomber bases that Russia was using to bomb Ukraine. So paraphrasing Oscar Wilde, for Patrick Pouyanné of Total, to make one mistake is unfortunate, but to make two in the space of a few days seems very careless. There's somewhere else the fossil fuel industry shouldn't be. The International Energy Agency has warned us that any new exploitation of new oil, gas, and coal reserves means there's no chance of us sticking to the 1.5 degree temperature rise limit agreed at Paris. So why is it that the fossil fuel industry is all over the world now exploring for oil? And why is it that all our governments are supporting them, promoting it? Well, here's one reason. This year, as we did last year, on day one of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, as soon as the list of delegates was published, we started crunching those numbers as well and discovered that of the 30,000 people there, delegates I'm talking about, 636 of them were connected to the fossil fuel industry. That's 25% more than last year. Their number outweighed the combined delegations of the top 10 countries most impacted by climate change. It was more than twice the representation of indigenous peoples. Total's boss was there, of course, but most shocking for us, I think, was that 200 of these delegates were actually on national delegations of countries. BP's aptly named CEO, Bernard Looney, was on Mauritania's delegation, where they're developing a gas field. And I read an article at the time that said that oil deals and gas deals were actually being made in the sidelines of COP27. It's like having a tobacco industry at a health conference. These two examples highlight some very important things about how corruption hinders the efforts to tackle climate change. Firstly, the fossil fuel industry is obviously absolutely used to getting its own way. It doesn't expect to be questioned, and it doesn't even bother too hard when it lies to us. And the reason for that is because it's not scared. But the industry has no place in these critically, globally important meetings. We need to take fossil fuel money out of politics, out of the climate change negotiations. We need to stop the revolving door, which whizzes around faster than an aeroplane propeller, between the government departments and the boardrooms of the fossil fuel industry. And we need to get our banks and finance houses to divest from these companies. In short, one of the biggest corruptors of our governments and of the whole climate change negotiations is money from big oil. We need to work hard on this. I'd argue even harder than we've worked on tackling illicit financial flows, public registries of companies, all the things that we've all worked on here. But this is the biggie. This really is the biggie. I want to end with another quote I really like from a soon-to-be-published book by a Brazilian journalist called Eliane Brum. If these are the adults in the control room of the world you live in, you only need average intelligence to enter panic mode. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Up next, we have Isabel de San Malo. She has had an extraordinary career. She was the Vice President and Foreign Minister of Panama between 2014 to 2019, the first woman ever to hold the role. She has more than 2 decades of experience working in sustainable development in Latin America. And today she's also a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So please welcome Isabel.
Good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and I cannot begin without thanking Transparency International for hosting this venue, for the work that you do every day, which is an uphill work, and congratulate all of the participants as well, because just the fact that you're here shows your commitment to a very complicated issue that requires more and more people to be working to solve it. I would like to have a message today on three things and speak as someone from the Global South and highlight the challenges that we face as countries from the South in dealing with climate change and with projects that impact climate change. And I would like to highlight three things. Number one, governance and the reality of weak institutions and what this does to our countries. Private sector, I would like to highlight the role of the private sector and how can the private sector contribute in these efforts. And lastly, the role of countries that have more capacity, more knowledge than some others do, because many times these countries are where the investments come from for these large projects that present huge challenges for our countries. And to refer to those three things, I will talk about Minera Panama, which is a project that happens in my own country, Panama, and highlight through that experience the delicate issues that we face. Panama, for those of you that do not know the country, is a small country, 4.3 million people. We have a global economy. 80% of our GDP comes from services, and our GDP is $68 billion per year. We are located between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and there the canal and the logistics sector is very, very big. Now, Minera Panama is a huge copper mine located in my country, Panama. We have not historically been a mining company, and our institutions in general are weak, but our institutions to deal with these sort of projects are weak and were non-existent many years ago. Actually, I would like to say, and I'm glad that someone from the panel is from UNDP, because the first mining map that was done in Panama before this project started about 50 years ago was done by UNDP. And then 50 years ago, UNDP said, this is a mining map of Panama, but this country is not ready in terms of institutions to go into this sector of the economy. That was said 50 years ago, and still today we are seeing the results of that happening. So Minera Panama has been exploiting the mine, and for the past 4 years has not had a contract. How did this happen? How did we come to such a big project without a contract? Well, the Panamanian Supreme Court ruled that the contract was unconstitutional, and ever since then, we have been trying to renegotiate a contract. Meanwhile, the mine extracts. It is not clear how much. We have been given figures this year that say that 40% of the company's revenues this year will come from this mine in Panama. So it is very, very big. It is a company that reported $2.8 billion in cash flows for last year. The result and what led us to where we are today, it's a consequence of several governments. This started 50 years ago when we had a military dictatorship, and that was when the concessions started to be explored. Several governments throughout the democratic period, including the government of which I was a part of, were part of the process in one way or another. The contract was signed several administrations ago, and because there are environmental activists that pay attention to these things and follow these things and did the legal work with McGill University, they were able to take a legal process that eventually declared the contract unconstitutional. Now, that doesn't mean that the project cannot happen. It just means that there are a number of empty voids that do not protect the country and that give us the frameworks for renegotiation. But I would like to highlight here is that in the corridors of power, when you have a country with limited resources, with weak institutions and corporations that have a lot of capacity and have a lot of possibilities in terms of pushing decisions, and the commitment perhaps is not there to work towards what? Towards the benefit of the people of Panama. These projects can bring positive things to countries. They bring employment, they create harm for the environment as well. So the negotiation is critical to ensure that projects are have a framework that ensures that the country is protected, that the people are protected, and we do not have that right now. I would also like to highlight the role of the countries where these resources are coming from, because this is a Canadian company, but there are investments in these projects from Canada, from Australia, and from South Korea, countries that are countries committed to the fight against corruption, that are countries committed to climate change, that are countries that have more knowledge and more capacity than my own. I am not saying it is their responsibility. I am not saying it is the company's responsibility. There is a role for us as a country and for governments as well. But we must make the fight against corruption and the role of transparency in the race for climate change, we must make it our own. It must be a collaborative process where we all take into consideration the weaknesses, the realities, and what we need to ensure in order for these projects to bring possibilities to countries. Moving forward, I would say that Panama can take advantage of this ruling of the Supreme Court to gather all of the scientific knowledge and data. Part of the problems that we have here is that we do not have enough data of what the mine is producing, how many resources it is producing. We don't have that data. The current government has set up a table of negotiation with the company, so that is moving forward. But I do believe that this is a collaborative process where if all of those that participate of the process have in mind the people of Panama, have in mind climate change, have in mind the importance of ensuring the framework for giving the space for getting what we can get out of these projects as positive, it's not going to happen otherwise. So moving forward, the power of corporations such as Minera Panama need to make emphasis on data, need to make emphasis on the presence of a country to contribute to a country. The role of the countries where these investments come from is also very important in the private sector. I mean, there is no climate change effort without the private sector. And we need to continue to highlight that, ensure transparency, ensure participation in moving forward. And I hope that bringing to light situations like this highlight the many spaces and following what Caroline said at the beginning, there are opportunities in highlighting these voids, and perhaps taking advantage of those opportunities, we can design a different and a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Up next, we have Disha Ravi. She's going to be joining us by video, I hope. Should be up on the screen in a second. She is a grassroots environmental activist from India and the founder of Fridays for Future India. So over to you, Disha. There you are.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Disha Ravi. I'm a climate justice activist from India. And in India, activism for protecting environment happens in different forms. Through art, through reports, through science, through indigenous wisdom, through music, through words, and through protests on the streets. But in the recent year, the governments have been clamping down on all forms of protest. Sometimes they've gone to the extent of punishing people for having thoughts that differ from their own. But one thing we've always fell back on was climate litigation. We believe that the judicial system would deliver justice, and in most cases they have. So what did the governments do to prevent that? They've been changing the laws. The beginning of the pandemic paved way for the perfect opportunity to change laws and make amendments to environmental laws. When all of us were concerned about the health of our loved ones and our community, the rights of nature was being stolen. In India, when you need to amend laws, you're required to announce the amendments publicly, The announcement has to be translated into 22 major languages of India, and the public needs to be given adequate amount of time to view it and respond to it with either suggestions or objections. But we weren't given any of that. They announced amendments to a very important environmental law called the Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA, in March 22 when the country was under lockdown. It wasn't translated into the 22 major languages. We weren't given enough time to respond, and people weren't notified adequately, nor were they translated to other languages. The amendments included easy approvals for projects for businesses. They legalized some existing environmental violations so that environmental criminals can walk free. They made a list of infrastructural projects that wouldn't need public consultations, a list that wasn't final, and a list they said they would add more projects to. Imagine that governments and big corporations want to open an iron ore next to your house, and they take away your right to speak against it, and this is exactly what they did. Our right to protect our home and our community was being taken away from us. This continued to other environmental laws like the Forest Conservation Act, another law that diluted the Forest Act to suit businesses, the Coastal Regulation Act notification that sought, among other things, to exempt oil and natural gas explorations and developmental activities from obtaining mandatory prior clearances. This was followed by Biological Diversity Amendment Bill and another one to amend the Wildlife Protection Act. All these changes were proposed when natural disasters such as the Chamoli Glacier burst, when the coastal region of India was experiencing high-intensity cyclones, and cloudburst-induced floods were washing away homes across the country. With our laws being amended, we were losing the right to use climate litigation as our only tool. But this phenomenon is not just limited to India. Global North countries with right-wing governments have a history of environmental destruction. Even the supposed progressive ones held off climate finance, adaptation fund, mitigation fund, and technological transfer at COP27 to combat climate change in the global south. As Patrick earlier mentioned, we saw a large fossil fuel representation among country delegations. These delegates had front row seats to impact climate negotiations. But there are some things that you don't negotiate with. You don't negotiate with our land. You don't negotiate with our oceans. You don't negotiate with our forests, and you definitely don't negotiate with the planet. But they did it anyway. They helped governments negotiate with the lives of those of us in the global south. And the change in the fraction of degrees is where the global south lives and dies. In the end of the conference, we found out that even the combined commitments from nearly 200 nations put Earth on track to warm around 2.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels by the century's end. These institutions that were tasked with protecting our homes sold them to make short-term profits. They sat in big air-conditioned rooms, drove in fancy cars, flew in private jets, and forgot that the food they ate came from the very land they're trying to plunder. Despite all of this, we will continue fighting for a better present and a better future. I would like to end with a very beautiful passage from George Eliot. We could never have loved the earth so well if we had had no childhood in it. If it were not for the earth, where the same flowers come up again every spring, that we used to gather with our tiny fingers as we sat lisping to ourselves in the grass, the same hips and haws on the autumn hedgerows, the same red breast we used to call God's bird, because they did no harm to the precious crops. What novelty is worth the sweet monotony where everything is known and loved because it is known? Thank you.
Thank you, Disha. That was fascinating. We will come back to you when we have our discussion later, so please stay on the line. Up next, we have Francine Pickup. She is the Deputy Director of the UNDP's Bureau for Policy and Programme Support. She has held leadership positions for the UNDP all over the world, Serbia, India, Indonesia, and she's also worked for the UN in Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, and others. So we've got a broad array of experience. Please welcome Francine.
I'm really pleased to be here and honoured to be on this panel with all these interesting speakers. We've heard a lot of quotes today, but I'm going to give you another one from the UN Secretary General at COP27. And he said, Antonio Guterres said, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator." And climate change is probably number one destructive issue of our time. And more than ever, we need global ambition that we're hoping to see in the COPs, in COP27 and now in COP15. And yet, what we're discussing here today is how much corruption is really hindering this fight at a time when we need it most. Transparency International estimates that between 1.4 and 35% of climate action funds, depending on the program in the country, are lost to corruption in the last 5 years. And the costs of this corruption are everywhere. We see it in money that's being siphoned off from work on climate change, obviously, but also from investments in schools, in roads, in hospitals, in all the SDGs. And climate and corruption reinforce each other. So on the one hand, we see that corruption fuels the climate crisis by depriving countries of badly needed finance and investment. And it significantly alters the allocation and distribution of resources to development objectives. So on the one hand, we see corruption fueling the climate crisis. On the other hand, we also see that climate crisis reinforces corruption by creating instability, inequality, hitting the poorest the hardest, fostering an environment that is more conducive to corruption and the misuse of funds. So overcoming corruption in a race against the climate crisis requires collective action and effective partnership between all of us, between government, the international community, the private sector and business, civil society, the media, to really ensure that the badly needed funds that we need in this space are invested correctly. This requires the government to step up their efforts on environmental finance. It requires businesses to strengthen their business integrity and responsibility and focus on sustainability. And it requires media, youth, and communities to continue to advocate against corruption. So I want to I really want to get to the discussion and the Q&A afterwards, but at this point I just want to make 3 points about 3 things we need to commit to. First point is really about the management of climate funds. We need to have much greater transparency and accountability in the use and management of climate finance that is investing in adaptation and mitigation. One good example is the Colombian climate finance tracking system, which provides updated data on domestic, public, private, and international climate funding. UNDP is empowering communities in Uganda and Sri Lanka to use digital tools to mainstream integrity and transparency in environmental resource management. And Isabel, you mentioned about the importance of government investing in capacity for data collection and analysis in this space. So better management of finance. Second point is around voice and accountability. leveraging the power of advocacy and accountability mechanisms. This means really creating civic spaces and meaningful participation of young people, empowering them to make policymakers accountable. So in the climate change agenda, fighting corruption is not only about money. It's very much about building trust in institutions and restoring hope in the future. You know, Fridays for the Future is an example of a movement that started because young people don't trust institutions and have decided that the best way they can have an impact is by working outside formal institutions because they have lost trust in those institutions. We've seen youth, we've seen civil society and communities challenging government inaction against environmental damage and climate change. We've seen that in India, in the way Disha explained. We've also seen it in my last duty station in Serbia. One thing that we've done within UNDP is we worked with, in the run-up to the COP26 in Glasgow, we worked with 120 countries in supporting them, building the capacity to increase their climate ambition, to increase their nationally determined contributions. And as part of that, and actually 106 of those countries did raise their climate ambitions. Now we really need to focus on implementation of those commitments. But as part of that work, we call it the Climate Promise, 110,000 people were engaged in that effort, engaged in stakeholder consultations on determining those nationally determined contributions, helping to build social consensus and explicit recognition of the roles of youth and women's organizations and others in making those climate pledges. And that happened in 94 countries. And then the third point that I wanted to mention is, again, something that Disha mentioned, which is around building a normative framework to protect rights, human rights. And Disha mentioned how in India, the justice space is a really important space for them to do that fight. So intensified work on environmental justice at the global and national level is perhaps one of the most exciting areas, I think, where work is taking place. In July this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a historic resolution that gave universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. From countries like Tanzania through to Chile, we're working to support over 100 national human rights institutions to address the human rights implications of climate change and environment degradation. This is really important work. So, friends, let me close by emphasizing that climate change really is the defining issue of our time. If we don't effectively deal with corruption in climate action, it will severely impede our action and ability to create the kind of change that we need. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francine. Up next, we have Magali Aliva. She is the director of the Environmental Governance Program at Poetica, and I'm so sorry to all the Spanish speakers, just forgive me and my accent, which is Transparency International's chapter in Peru. She works with environmental defenders and indigenous people in Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, and has been doing some fascinating work. She's going to present to us, and she's going to have some images up on the screen, so do have a look. She'll be speaking in Spanish as well. There should have been some links for you to download a translation app on your way through, or the Google app, Google Translate can do it as well, for anyone who doesn't speak Spanish. So if you need to do all of that, I can give you a couple of seconds, but it looks like everyone's still sitting down, so I will hand over now. Go ahead.
Gracias por invitarme primero a ser parte de esta formidable conferencia
y para mí es un privilegio además enorme poder estar aquí parada frente a todos ustedes y frente también a compartir el panel con ustedes. Quiero iniciar refiriéndome a la fallida ruptura del orden democrático ocurrido el día de ayer en mi país y que terminó con la vacancia del ciudadano Pedro Castillo, quien, poniéndose al margen de la ley y de la Constitución de mi país, buscó capturar el poder justamente, ¿no?, para librarse de serias acusaciones de corrupción hacia él y hacia su entorno inmediato. El autogolpe de Estado que dio el día de ayer y que apenas duró unas horas es una clara muestra de cómo la corrupción socava una nación y cómo la puede llevar al caos y a la fragilidad en tan solo unos minutos. Sin embargo, y a pesar de la grave crisis política que venimos enfrentando y soportando desde hace ya varios años, nuestro país seguirá resistiendo, solo si impulsamos las reformas políticas que requerimos. Y ahora sí, voy a entrar al tema que nos convoca hoy, que es sobre crisis climática y corrupción. Las ganancias provenientes de delitos ambientales triplican los esfuerzos financieros globales para luchar contra el cambio climático. El informe Gafi, que fue publicado en el año 2019 sobre delitos ambientales, estima, sin cuantificar temas relacionados a cultivos ilícitos y narcotráfico, que se encuentran entre los delitos que generan las ganancias más rentables alrededor del mundo. Estamos hablando de entre 110.000 y 281.000 millones de dólares anuales, mientras que los compromisos de financiamiento climático para luchar contra el cambio climático son de 100.000 millones de dólares anuales, es decir, casi lo triplican, ¿no?, los delitos ambientales. ¿Y ustedes saben cuánto este porcentaje de estos 100.000 millones de dólares para luchar contra el cambio climático se destinan para frenar la corrupción, el crimen organizado o el lavado de activos? Pues no existe una medición global, sin embargo les ofrezco una muestra. Con el apoyo del Programa de Integridad de la Gobernanza Climática de Transparency International, con quienes trabajamos hace ya 10 años, para garantizar que los fondos climáticos sean manejados con integridad, con transparencia y con rendición de cuentas, y que ayuden a las personas más vulnerables a adaptarse a la crisis climática. En Perú hicimos un estudio sobre esto y quisimos centrarnos en los proyectos que luchan contra la deforestación de los bosques amazónicos, identificando proyectos de Red Plus que tienen que ver con proyectos de la Amazonía. ¿Por qué la Amazonía? ¿Por qué para nosotros en América Latina nos importa tanto la Amazonía? Pues porque es el laboratorio de las ilegalidades que se desarrollan en nuestro continente o en esta parte del sur global. Y de manera paralela es donde más fondos climáticos se invierten, centrando esfuerzos de la comunidad internacional para frenar la deforestación y las emisiones globales. Nuestra investigación encontró que del 2016 al 2021 solo el 2% de los proyectos tenían algún objetivo o algún resultado directamente relacionado a la lucha contra la corrupción. ¿Y por qué se hace necesario que la corrupción ¿por qué es necesario luchar y hablar contra la corrupción cuando hablamos de la crisis climática? Porque América Latina alberga alrededor del 50% de la biodiversidad del planeta y una cuarta parte de los bosques tropicales de todo el mundo. La región también es en paralelo uno de los principales puntos de origen de la deforestación por el comercio mundial de madera. Mi experiencia de trabajo se desarrolla principalmente visibilizando y luchando contra el vínculo perverso que existe entre corrupción y deforestación de bosques amazónicos. Los bosques del mundo ayudan a luchar, a frenar el cambio climático, ya que los árboles, como ustedes saben, capturan gases de efecto invernadero. La corrupción, sin embargo, es el driver que está detrás de todos los drivers de deforestación. La corrupción soporta, apoya, viabiliza y ejecuta acciones como tráfico de tierras, tal ilegal, y su comercio asociado, trata de personas, tráfico de minería ilegal. Sin embargo, los proyectos climáticos para luchar contra la deforestación destinan fondos insuficientes para enfrentar la corrupción.
el crimen organizado y los delitos financieros que perpetran y penetran y capturan al Estado. Mientras las ilegalidades avanzan en alianza con funcionarios, quienes se supone deben ser los implementadores de estos proyectos climáticos, los poderosos flujos de dinero ilícito que se desprenden de estas actividades ilegales financian campañas políticas, capturan regulatoriamente al Estado y generan estados paralelos en donde los más perjudicados siguen siendo las poblaciones locales vulnerables, los pueblos indígenas y los pequeños agricultores usuarios de estos recursos naturales. Pero en última instancia, somos todos. Antes de continuar, yo quisiera pedir que se ponga de pie si es que hay algún representante en esta sala de pueblos indígenas o de pequeños agricultores. Solo una persona levanta la mano. Darle voz a las víctimas de corrupción, construyendo junto a ellos acciones efectivas para luchar contra la corrupción y la emergencia climática y la deforestación y los delitos ambientales, hoy más que nunca es absolutamente necesario. La corrupción, aliada a los crímenes ambientales, como menciona claramente el informe de Global Witness, indica que el 68% de los asesinatos de defensores ambientales en los últimos 10 años han sido registrados en América Latina. Las comunidades indígenas, a su vez, concentran el 39% de estos ataques registrados, pese a que representan solamente el 5% de la población mundial. América Latina, además, se ubicó como la región más peligrosa del mundo para los defensores ambientales, y tanto de territorios, de tierras y de medio ambiente. Los conflictos por la tierra efectivamente son uno de los factores detonantes para que los ataquen, para que los asesinen y para que empiecen a haber migraciones enormes hacia ellos. La lucha siempre tiene que ver con cómo se ejerce el control territorial, quién lo ejerce y quién ejerce el poder. Por ello, desde hace un año, sostuvimos la primera audiencia temática ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos de Defensores Ambientales. Por primera vez en la región se presentaron y se visibilizó el vínculo perverso que había entre corrupción y violación de derechos humanos de defensores ambientales. Llevamos 4 casos de 4 comunidades y pueblos indígenas que habían sido asesinados por este tipo de delitos. Y también mostramos cómo la corrupción soporta todas estas ilegalidades y cómo la corrupción se mantiene impune a lo largo de este tiempo y de estos años y de estos asesinatos. A pesar de los compromisos y los esfuerzos globales para luchar contra la crisis climática, la realidad es que cuando estos recursos llegan a los países para ser implementados, como ya lo hemos dicho, llegan sin dientes. Estos recursos serán administrados e implementados por instituciones públicas con serios índices de corrupción, con debilidad institucional y deslegitimidad, e inclusive con funcionarios públicos investigados por corrupción, por peculado, por lavado de activos, por malversación de fondos. En países de la cuenca amazónica, como Colombia, Brasil o Perú, autoridades que tienen competencias en la región de recursos naturales tienen serios cuestionamientos por el tema de delitos ambientales y los delitos anteriormente indicados. El éxito de la ejecución de los delitos ambientales, como ustedes saben, se soporta en la corrupción. La corrupción facilita el acceso a los recursos naturales extraídos de manera ilegal y permite movilizarlos por todo el mundo. La corrupción facilita a su vez el acceso a los recursos naturales a través de documentación falsa en materia de concesiones y de permisos que permite revestir de ilegal lo legal. La corrupción en este sector, además, no se trata de autócratas individuales que arrastran los recursos de un gobierno, sino que son redes criminales con facilitadores y con operadores que se aprovechan del debilitamiento de las institucionalidades democráticas para capturar las entidades públicas. La corrupción, por tanto, permite falsificar documentos para probar el origen legal de los recursos naturales, para dar la apariencia de que estos recursos están siendo exportados a países y que su origen tiene origen legal, ¿no? Por tanto, es importantísimo empezar a trabajar, cuando hablamos de lucha contra el cambio climático, también de trazabilidad delictiva en la cuenca amazónica y más allá de la cuenca amazónica, en todos los biomas naturales que hay alrededor de todos los continentes del mundo. Por ello, desde Proética, además, creemos que creamos un observatorio que se llama el Observatorio de Legalidad de la Madera, que es un observatorio bastante interesante. regresé. Pero creamos un observatorio de legalidad de la madera que lo que trabaja y lo que hace es mirar interacciones de criminalidad y que nos permite además identificar actores. Aquí está, este es el observatorio, que está en inglés, además para los que quieren, está en inglés y en español para los que quieren identificarlo y buscarlo. Nos permite identificar actores por región, por año, por localidad. Lo hemos hecho primero en Perú y lo queremos hacer para toda América Latina con los países de la cuenca amazónica para mirar el tema de trazabilidad delictiva. Lo hemos articulado además con la Unidad de Inteligencia Financiera para mirar articulación y flujos de dinero ilícito que se desprenden de ellos. También lo hemos articulado y está interoperando ya con una plataforma de la Procuraduría Ambiental, que es la que mira todo el tema de delitos ambientales en nuestro país. Y los delitos ambientales, nuevamente, y el avance de otras actividades económicas invaden y despojan los territorios de los pueblos indígenas amazónicos aliados a autoridades corruptas. Hablar de crímenes ambientales en la cuenca amazónica no nos sitúa solo territorialmente en los maravillosos bosques amazónicos de América. Los incontables flujos de dinero ilícito, producto de estas economías ilegales, penetra el sistema formal, debilita los estados, quiebra voluntades y genera deforestación, genera muertes, migraciones, pobreza y degradación de nuestros ecosistemas. He querido mostrar lo que nos enfrenta o a lo que nos enfrentamos los países amazónicos, no para deprimirnos, sino para juntos buscar soluciones viables. Más allá de los malos gobiernos que tenemos, de la pandemia y de sus consecuencias y de la terrible crisis climática que estamos atravesando, juntos, sin dejar a nadie atrás, y ahí incluyo nuevamente los pueblos amazónicos, con innovación, con creatividad y con articulación, podremos seguir formando coaliciones para enfrentar la corrupción, la emergencia climática. No tenemos otra opción y, sobre todo, debemos entender que el tiempo de actuar es ahora. Gracias.
Excellent, thank you. Our last speaker is Professor Stephen Gardner. He's the Professor of Human Dimensions of the Environment at the University of Washington, which is actually in Seattle. He has written extensively on the ethics of the fight against climate change, and now he's going to come up and speak to us about it too.
Thank you very much. I've heard that Washington is famous in more than one place. Let me start by thanking the IAC and especially Bryce Bomer for the kind invitation to speak today. For my opening statement, I'd like to highlight 3 points. First, we live in a context of spectacular moral failure. Climate change is fundamentally an ethical challenge and one where justice is central. I call it a perfect moral storm. Currently, the international community, and indeed humanity in general, is failing to meet that challenge. Climate change is the most serious threat of our time, I think, and perhaps of any time. Yet more than 30 years after the commitment of the Rio Earth Summit to protect current and future generations against dangerous climate change, emissions are more than 40% higher annually. The 1.5 target is being described as being on life support, and the Paris Agreement is said by analysts to favor the rich countries most and be least beneficial to Africa, arguably the most vulnerable continent. After 30 years, it's difficult to see the UNFCCC process to this point as anything but a monumental moral failure. My second point is that we should keep ethics and justice front and center. Climate change involves major threats to humanity as such, but especially to poor and marginalized communities, to the young and other future generations, and to non-human nature. The threats to poor and marginalized communities have rightly been getting more attention recently amidst an upsurge of interest in structural inequalities, environmental racism, and the legacy of colonialism. So I will highlight a more neglected issue. I want to emphasize the profound intergenerational threat, and especially the problem of earlier generations engaging in a tyranny of the contemporary over later generations, where they use their asymmetric power over the future to inflict severe harms on the young and other future generations, often for the sake of only moderate gains and luxuries in the present. In my view, past climate agreements have actively facilitated the tyranny of the contemporary. That they have done so is predictable under the perfect moral storm analysis, but is often obscured by moral corruption. By this I mean that as well as more standard forms of corruption, which do play a very deep role, the intergenerational profile of climate change encourages corruption of the ways in which we think and talk about the climate problem, including with respect to norms, principles, and institutions. There are lots of examples. For example, I would say that intergenerational moral corruption infects how we talk about climate targets, institutional reform, and even radical technological interventions, such as solar radiation management, a form of geoengineering. Let's pause for a moment to comment on targets. Sometimes people talk about what it would take to be on track to meet the 1.5 or 2 degree targets, acknowledging that we're not remotely on track right now. But the mainstream modeling around what it takes to be on track is securing something like a 50 or 66% chance of meeting the climate goals. And those numbers are also based on a massive contribution from carbon removal technologies that are as yet in early development stages, and we don't know how to deploy at scale. Think of this in terms of an analogy. Suppose you went to a parent-teacher conference to find out about the progress of your child, and you were told that your child was on track to graduate from high school. You feel pretty good about this. You then question the teacher about exactly what they mean by on track. They say, well, your child has a 66% chance of graduating high school. So a 1 in 3 chance of failing. Right? I don't think you would be very happy. I think you would be pulling the alarm cord and thinking urgent intervention was needed. Suppose the teacher then added, under further questioning, that even the 2/3 chance relied on the use of educational technologies which didn't yet exist and weren't deployed in your school district yet and hadn't been tested. Right? Again, I think you'd be appalled. And these are the only two of the examples of the compromises going on around intergenerational targets. They speak to the really live probability of moral corruption infecting the standards being applied to intergenerational protection. My third and final point is that the anti-corruption community could play a major role in resisting moral corruption, including intergenerational moral corruption, as well as other more traditional kinds of climate corruption. Among other things, I propose that the IACC and other groups should endorse, promote, and practice the following strategies. First, they should emphasize that effective climate action requires what I'll call following the ethics rather than just following the science, where following the ethics includes both respecting the science but also keeping it in its place. Second, they should promote transparency about the justice implications of various kinds of climate policy, norms, and institutions, including by advocating for active transparency to expose and keep track of salient issues of justice, as well as simply pushing for disclosure in a more passive way. Intergenerational transparency should be especially emphasized. Third, anti-corruption groups should engage in what I call defensive ethics that protects norms of justice and intergenerational ethics from becoming degraded or marginalized. And fourth and finally, I propose that the anti-corruption community should advocate for better institutions. Here, I would emphasize the need for a new intergenerational institutions designed to neutralize the tyranny of the contemporary. To achieve this, elsewhere I've argued for a global constitutional convention for future generations. This deliberative forum would be vaguely akin to other constitutional conventions that have occurred in countries throughout the world, but this time aimed at protecting future generations over the very long term. I'd be happy for any help in promoting that effort. In my view, institutional denial is an even more serious problem than denial of climate science, and intergenerational moral corruption is a significant part of that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We are surprisingly on time, so I think we will have about 20 minutes now for everyone to talk. We've got Disha coming back to be part of the discussion, I hope. So I have some questions that I'll ask, but I also really want to have everyone on this panel talking to each other, because I think there's a lot of really interesting overlap between what everyone's been talking about. So please feel free to jump in if you have questions or things you'd like to say yourself. I am a journalist after all, so I'm going to start with a news hook. Magali, yesterday the president of Peru, Pedro Castillo, was arrested. I mean, he came in on this wave of optimism. He was seen as someone who represented people from rural communities for the first time. And now he is in jail, and he's accused of leading a criminal organization that profited from state contracts and obstructed investigations. And I wanted to ask what your thoughts are and what this will mean for your work, because you've made a lot of progress representing environmental defenders, and I want to know if this will be a problem or a step back for you.
Gracias. Gracias por la pregunta. Efectivamente, el día de ayer, como yo he mencionado, inclusive en una sesión hace el día de ayer justo, el Perú está sufriendo una crisis política muy fuerte en los últimos 5 años. Hemos tenido 5 presidentes, casi cambiando un presidente por año, e inclusive en menos tiempo. Castillo en realidad entró al país no porque representara un sector de la población rural, sino porque en realidad él recibió un voto a favor o en contra, mejor dicho, de Fujimori, ¿no? Castillo entró a nuestro país como presidente con un porcentaje muy bajo de votación, lo cual también hizo que no tenga un respaldo popular muy alto. ¿Sí? ¿Entiendes? Y entonces, lo que ha ocurrido con él es que el día de ayer, que efectivamente hizo un autogolpe y luego tuvo una vacancia presidencial y actualmente está encarcelado, lo que ha ocasionado es que inmediatamente, aunque entren o salgan algunos actores políticos, y en este caso inclusive los de mayor alto y de mayor rango en nuestro país, configura una perpetuación de la crisis y del sistema perverso en el cual nos encontramos. La corrupción, como ya mencionaba, ha ido capturando poderes del Estado, ha ido capturando sectores en desmedro de la población indígena. Los últimos años hemos visto en Perú, por ejemplo, y en América Latina también, y a partir de la pandemia, cómo se han intensificado los delitos ambientales, los asesinatos hacia defensores ambientales cada vez son más altos, más grandes, con mayor frecuencia, y la deforestación y la degradación ha aumentado. Entonces, en realidad, pueden salir o entrar funcionarios públicos, pero como la corrupción es sistémica en nuestro país, lamentablemente, entran otros jugadores. Así tú cojas a un actor, a un funcionario público, va a entrar 1, 2 o 3 en lugar de ese funcionario público a trabajar dentro de un sistema que ya está, que es corrupto ahora, ¿no? Entonces lo que se tiene que hacer son reformas. Nosotros, como decía al inicio de mi presentación, podemos y estamos resistiendo, sin embargo, las crisis cada vez son más seguidas y son más duras. Hemos tenido un autogolpe el día de ayer y una crisis muy fuerte institucional, pero cada vez las instituciones son más débiles, cada vez hay menos legitimidad y cada vez la ciudadanía está más harta, más cansada y más empobrecida también. Así que lo que toca son reformas, reformas y más reformas y participación de ciudadanía. Gracias.
Thank you. I don't know, Isabel, if you wanted to kind of respond to that. I mean, I wanted to ask you, I was really, really interested in your discussion of the private sector and particularly the mine in Panama. We did an investigation in Guatemala into a major nickel mine there that was published earlier this year, and the thing that really jumped out at me that we found was that, that the relationship between government and the private sector and what can happen when you are dealing with companies, fossil fuel companies, mining companies that have more influence and more money than the people who are meant to be regulating them. And I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that, and also if you had any kind of feedback on Magali's comments too.
Thank you, Caroline. And actually, everything is correlated, and I definitely want to comment on what's happening in Peru, because what happened in Peru yesterday, it's not alone pertaining to Peru. If we look at Latin America, it's been crisis after crisis and political crisis one after the other, and this is the result, going back to my message, of weak institutions, and we need to pay a lot of attention to that. She also commented on the role of public officers and how they are involved or not. And going back to the mine in Panama, which I presented a 50-year story of how we got to where we are. When that UNDP report came out 50 years ago saying that the country was not prepared to go into this sector, we started training public officers to deal with mining. And the result was that the first concession given for this mining company that today is in the problems, or has us in the problems that we are, was given to the same public officers that were trained by the state to represent the state. So it's a vicious circle of countries trying to prepare themselves, train their institutions, and sums of money luring them. It's a complex issue, and this vicious circle needs to be highlighted and needs to be called to the attention of all of us. And the role of the private sector, it's huge. And the more that we expose the intricacies and the correlation between these things, the more we can strive to advance. But we do have huge challenges, and governance is the challenge for Latin America in every way. Corruption is related to weak governance. Political crises are related to weak governance, and our possibility in the future is related to governance as well.
So Francine, I'd like to turn to you about the issue of governance. I think, UNDP is, I think, one of the largest sustainable investors in the whole world. You work in, I think, 170 countries, according to Google. And that means that you are going into countries and partnering with governments where corruption is deeply rooted within the structure of how they work. And this is a challenge that you have to face on a daily basis. So I wanted to ask you, and I think this is something that, there's a lot of politicians and donors at this conference, and I think this is something that just doesn't get discussed enough. You go into countries where corruption exists. It is something you have to cope with. You have to factor it in, you have to mitigate it, and you have to do everything you can. How do you do it? Please, nice simple question.
People are laughing because it's a crazy question.
I know, sorry.
So governance is the bread and butter of the work that UNDP does, and it's one of the pillars of our work in the many countries that we work in. What Isabel was saying is very true. I think lack of weak institutions are a critical issue in addressing corruption. And what we do when we work in countries is we work with governments, we work with the private sector, we work with civil society to try and strengthen those institutions. So when it comes to issues around environmental governance, I think You know, one of the things that struck me in this conference is the importance of breaking down silos and working in integrated ways. I mean, we have a community here that focuses on anti-corruption. I think it's really important within UNDP, but you know, within the community more broadly, that we come together. And the people on this panel are working in both fields, but we need to make sure that the people who work in governance field and the people who work on environment, often very technical people working on very specific issues in the environment space, are talking to each other and working together. And so as UNDP, we work closely with governments. We oftentimes have very good relationships with governments, and we try and build that change from the inside. That's why I'm proud for working for the organization that I work for, because we don't believe in imposing change from the outside, but really building those institutions and structures and capacities from the inside. It's strategies, it's laws, it's policies, it's programs, it's work plans, it's getting people trained, and it's about building the whole ecosystem. So as I said, not just the government, but strengthening civil society, the responsibility of the private sector, and connecting the dots between the different parts.
Thank you. Disha, I think you encounter a lot of the problems that we've been talking about, but maybe from a different perspective. And you were talking about the issue of kind of state capture in India and the diminishing avenues for you to make change through legal cases, through activism, things like that. I wondered if you had a take on the issue of dealing with like corruption within state institutions and how you can make change as kind of a young person looking at the environment now and wanting to build a better future. What avenues do you feel are still open to you, and what can people learn from what you're doing in India and other countries?
Very honestly, in India, our avenues are very limited. To even meet our Minister of Environment, we had to go to COP and, you know, try to seek out an appointment where we can converse with him. While in other countries, they can just walk up to the ministry and converse with their ministers. So I don't know how much we can possibly achieve within this system, because I don't think the governments and the people in power are ready to listen to young people. This is something we have experienced in the past over and over again, because we've tried to make that change. We've tried to talk policy and laws with those in power, with different governments, with different government offices even. But we have been dismissed because we are young. We have been dismissed because we have different opinions and we have critiques of their work, which isn't something that they are welcoming of, which is why I spoke about the legal mechanism being one of the most effective avenues to push what we actually are demanding out of the streets. And that is being taken away from us. But I do hope that in other countries, that if governments are willing to listen, there are several avenues that young people can draft up to have that conversation. But in India, our governments, all of them, not just the ruling party, aren't open to sitting across young people and having that discussion. And that would be the first step, honestly, to change anything within the system itself.
Thank you. Patrick, I wanted to kind of throw to you. Disha mentioned COP27, and you were talking about that in your speech as well. I wondered kind of what your take is on the kind of, I mean, in my job, we talk a lot more about, you know, the kind of corruption that you might think of traditionally, you know, under the table wads of cash, or magic carpets as it is in Guatemala. And I wanted to get your take on what seems to be now this kind of creep of what I would call like softer corruption, the kind of backdoor lobbying, the influence of fossil fuel companies in places like COP27, which in some ways seems to be almost more dangerous for the future of our ability to address climate change. So I wanted to ask kind of what your thoughts were on that and how we can try and make any changes to address this kind of corruption going forward.
Can we hear that? Yeah, thank you. I think you called it a softer corruption. I would call it a more insidious corruption. It's even more invisible than the brown envelope. I think, well, I sort of touched on it. I really strongly believe, you know, luckily in the UK we have a stable government, of course. I'm not sure which one it is today, but what you're seeing there is, you know, the power of the fossil fuel industry. It funds politicians of all sides in this country, in my country. That happens across the world. It sponsors sport, so kids from an early age, of, you know, like in Ireland right now, are playing on a football pitch with Texaco stuck up on the side of it. They come out with their greenwashing ads. They are so rich. You know, they're richer than many governments in some parts of the world. I strongly believe we need to take fossil fuel money out of politics. Actually, I would take all corporate money out of politics. I think political parties should be funded by the state. I don't know to what formula. Because as long as you have that industry in there, and we know, and whether it's, you know, fossil fuels or the arms industry, you know, in the UK, you know, you become a general in the army and your next job's in an arms company. If you're a politician, you're going to be in one industry or other, and it's very likely to be a fossil fuel company. And so you're not going to upset that industry. You know, that's your retirement ticket. You won't get into power unless you accept their money. You've got these dark think tanks funded by the fossil fuel industry. You have the American Petroleum Institute, which neutered the law, Dodd-Frank 1504 section of Dodd-Frank in this country to get oil and mining companies to declare the payments they make to foreign governments. Their power is immense, they're insidious, and they just need to be taken out.
Thank you. Stephen, I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of the long-term implications and the intergenerational implications of the kind of changes that we're talking about here. Like if you do have this kind of creep of influence and capital into politics, like what does that mean for the future?
Well, is this working? Yes, it is. As you know, I think we need intergenerational political reform. We need new institutions. I think as part of that, we need to think very seriously about the design of those institutions, including, I think the right sort of venue would be a global constitutional convention to fill what I think of as this governance gap. Thinking about what to do about the influence of money and other corrosive corruption forces will be a central part of such a global constitutional convention, because we'd want the institutions to be effective, and there's a lot to be learned from our current experience with other institutions that aren't functioning very well. One thing I wouldn't like to happen would be if the prospect of new institutions was held to a much higher bar than we usually hold institutions to. Even, we should have high bars around preventing corruption, and we should try to learn things, but sometimes the notion of creating new institutions is heavily problematized, because people say there's a lack of political will, and then they say even if there were a political will at the grassroots level, it would inevitably be perverted by these corrosive forces. I don't want to minimize the challenges there, but I think this is just the world we live in when we're trying to govern with respect to all manner of problems, and especially problems that involve large amounts of money and large concentrations of power. And I think it's ironic that, that the other thing that's bubbling up as being actively discussed as what we do next about climate change, if we continue to fail, is not, the Global Constitutional Convention. It's radical geoengineering interventions like spraying sulfates into the stratosphere. I'm off to a conference after this one on that. And there, the concentrations of power would be, by definition, massive. We really do lack governance at that structure, at that level. And combating the influence of corrosive forces would be, if anything, even more important than it already is in all these other venues. And yet, by and large, people are much more sympathetic to the idea of, oh, we really need to investigate that, rather than investigating the Global Constitutional Convention, which to me is kind of crazy, because I suspect to do, even if it were possible to do it, and I'm a little skeptical, but even if it were possible to do the geoengineering and it seemed in some ways desirable, I think the very next thing you'd need to solve is a massive governance challenge that will be vulnerable to all these corruptive forces. So you'd have to, in effect, do the GCC anyway. So it's bizarre that we're favoring the one approach over the other, in at least the public imagination right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have that much time left, but I wanted to throw this open to the floor. If you have questions, I think there's a microphone here and another one over there. So if you want to go up and introduce yourself, and I'd ask that you keep it concise and ask questions, not make statements.
So my name is Maria Cristina. I help a lot of people in Brazil. I helped Valdelice Veron. She's the chief of Guaranis in Brazil. Her father was killed in front of her and the niece raped. And she won at Vital Voices the awards. And she designed who is like doing the violence. And basically it was the Minister of Agriculture of Brazil, the biggest congressman, the guy who has biggest lands in the Mato Grosso do Sul is a congressman, the new elected governor, and a company that is a mix of Cosan, which is the alcohol, and Shell. So how can you do something to shield these people? They cannot even go to the small villages to buy food and everything. How can you shield them if all the main politicians from their state are involved on the violence regarding them?
Was that to anyone in particular, Magali, or she works in Brazil?
I think whoever works with, I think him and her, they are both very into the Brazilian Amazonia, so I want to know, how do you solve this?
Magali, did you want to respond?
Gracias por la pregunta. En realidad los desafíos que enfrentan los defensores ambientales y los pueblos indígenas en general, ¿no?, tanto en la Amazonía como alrededor del mundo, son enormes, ¿no? Se puede pensar que solamente son impactos aislados, ¿no? O se puede pensar que son impactos que no trascienden. Sin embargo, como yo decía en mi presentación, tenemos que mirar todo el tema de trazabilidad delictiva y empezar a desenmadejar y entender quién está detrás, ¿no? Los actores que están detrás no son simples operadores o simples facilitadores de las actividades ilegales. Detrás hay funcionarios públicos del más alto nivel, como ministros inclusive, pero también detrás hay empresas. Cuando hablamos de asesinatos, de violaciones de derechos humanos, cuando hablamos de deforestación, cuando hablamos de degradación, también estamos hablando de grandes corporaciones, no solamente de actores ilegales. Estamos hablando de grandes corporaciones articulados, por ejemplo, a palma aceitera, articulados, por ejemplo, inclusive a cacao, que se hacen de territorios, de tierras, en asociación efectivamente con la corrupción y en alianza también con funcionarios para despojar a estas poblaciones. No hay respuestas únicas sobre tu pregunta, lamentablemente. Sin embargo, creo que, como decía también, formar coaliciones, trabajo articulado con operadores de justicia, tanto para el tema ambiental, pero articulado con crimen organizado, con lavado de activos y con corrupción, y con las unidades de inteligencia financiera, nos puede ayudar a sacar la discusión de los delitos ambientales y de los asesinatos a defensores ambientales, donde está ubicado ahora. Está ubicado aún en una agenda ambiental, pero hay que ubicarla en nuestra agenda más grande, y creo que por eso yo estoy muy agradecida de estar en este momento acá, porque es el espacio donde tiene que hablarse. Acá en la IACC es el espacio donde tiene que hablarse lo que está ocurriendo con la deforestación, lo que está ocurriendo con el cambio climático, lo que está ocurriendo con el mal manejo de los recursos naturales, y cómo esto nos enfrenta y nos confronta para hacer acciones mucho más conjuntas, articuladas, como decía, sin dejar a nadie atrás, y en eso los pueblos indígenas son vitales. Gracias.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, at the risk of repeating, because I don't speak Spanish, but there's no easy answer to the question. I think one of the big problems throughout our work on land and environmental defenders is impunity. Prosecutions are incredibly rare, convictions are even rarer. And as long as that situation lasts, then people are going to keep on killing or raping or whatever they do. Obviously, what one hopes is that the country will develop its systems to a point where that won't happen. But until that happens, what you can do is, if the people who are committing those crimes have committed any kind of international crime or crime that can be tried in another jurisdiction, like corruption, you can go for them that way. But I just want to say there's some good news here, is that we've thought about this, and we are just part of a very big coalition of civil society organizations and communities and activists around the world. We've been working very hard for a few years to get a new law in the European Union, which was approved this Monday, and it's called the Corporate Supply Chain Due Diligence Directive. And what that does is it means there are a few flaws in the law, but in principle, anyone importing goods into Europe has to demonstrate that there are no human rights or environmental harms in that supply chain. And if they lie and the goods come in, those companies can get fined heavily. And that kind of thing means that although in the country of where the violence is taking place, it might be harder to deal with it, but we can actually starve those businesses of the money they want. It's not an immediate answer, but I think if other countries do that, but the EU is one of the world's largest trading blocs, is a really, really good start.
Forgive me, I know we have one more question, but I did want to ask Isabel, I know that you've worked a lot on transparency and international regulation. I wondered if you just had any comments in light of what Patrick was saying about how, like, what these kind of international standards on transparency can do, and what the limitations are in countries where it's difficult to enforce them.
I think they're super important, and to countries like mine, with the weaknesses that I have highlighted, they become even more important. It's a ray of light, because they do impose severe sanctions on corporations and countries that prevent business, and at the end, if you have something that affects business, that will immediately have an impact on your behavior. That does work. So I do believe in international efforts, sanctions, and regulations, and I do have hope for that pushing regulation in the global south. It has been happening. We need it to happen faster, but it has been happening.
Sorry, there was another question, but I had jumped in. Anyone else? Oh, I think there's someone overhead. There, would you like to go up to the microphone? Did you have a question?
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Baji Koulibaly. I'm from Mali. So first of all, I would like to thank your brilliant panel that helped us to discover many things about that topic. So, as far as gold production is concerned in my country, the local people really suffer from that field. First of all, what we notice in most of African countries, particularly in mine, investors who come for exploiting gold, they drop by without any investigation in terms of life record, in terms of their code of conduct. And then the sad thing is that those lands that are abound in gold are sold off to the prejudice of owners. And in terms of compensation of those lands sold off, what we notice is that local authorities are given huge amount of money that are finally embezzled by local authorities. So this term of gold production somehow should be something profitable for local population. Unfortunately, it's not the case. So things are getting worse and worse in those rural areas. That was my contribution to that panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francine, I wondered if you were nodding a lot there during that. I wondered if you had any comments that you wanted to make.
Thank you very much. And yes, we see examples like this again and again, where you have extractive industries that can potentially make an awful lot of money for the country. The profits are not benefiting the development of the country. It's commonly referred to as the resource curse. I think from where we stand, I mean, in UNDP, we would simply stress the importance in that situation of governance again, of transparency in sharing information about the negotiations that are going on between the company and the government, an inclusive process where local communities and citizens are part of the dialogue around the potential contracts, where contracts are published, and so on. And I think that, the role of civil society in accountability and oversight of these kinds of deals is really critical. Most recently, I was in Serbia, and many of you will have followed the protests, the demonstrations around the Rio Tinto lithium contracts. Actually, there was huge uproar, and the contracts were halted. So civil society, if it is organized, can make a real difference. But I think the most important thing to say is transparency in sharing information and inclusive dialogue around those contracts.
Thank you. I think we've just about run out of time, so thank you very much to everyone who came. Thank you to all of our panels. I think it was a fascinating debate, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks to you, Caroline, our moderator, and to our speakers, including Disha, who's joining us virtually from India. It is lunchtime. Enjoy your lunch. We'll be back here at 1:30 for Plenary 5. Thank you.